Welcome, dear listener, to a quiet, sheltered corner of the wizarding world. The Great War has ended. The last curses have faded into history. The air no longer tastes of smoke and panic. And yet peace, as we so often forget, can be its own kind of trial. Because when the fighting stops, the mind finally has space to feel everything it postponed. Tonight, we follow two souls who stood beside the boy who lived when the world was breaking, and who are now learning how to live in a world that's trying to knit itself back together. Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger survived the chaos. They survived the impossible. Now they must survive the quiet. Let us settle in, breathe slowly, and step into a spring morning at the Burrow, where sunlight falls softly on crooked windows and where the future waits, wide, unfamiliar, and oddly frightening, on the other side of the kitchen door. The first day of May 1998 arrived like a gentle apology. The sky was clear, the air mild, and the fields around the Burrow lay in patchwork greens and golds, as if the land itself was trying to remember how to be ordinary. Inside the Weasley kitchen, ordinary was still a fragile thing. Copper pots hung from the ceiling, and a kettle murmured steadily on the stove, kept warm by an old charm that had been cast so long ago no one remembered who started it. The room smelled of fresh bread and tea, and the faint familiar comfort of Molly Weasley's cooking, comfort that had carried this family through birthdays and arguments and Christmas mornings. Now it carried them through grief. Ron sat at the scarred wooden table with a cup of tea cooling between his hands, watching the steam curl upward and vanish. He was 20 years old. He looked the same, mostly tall, freckled, red-haired, but there was a heaviness in him now, a weight behind his eyes that hadn't been there when he was younger. The war had taken something subtle from him, not his courage, not his loyalty, something softer, something like ease. He didn't really notice his own stillness until Hermione walked in. She moved quietly, still half asleep, her hair untamed the way it always was in the mornings, as if sleep made it forget the rules of the world. She crossed the room without thinking, and as she passed behind him, her hand reached out automatically and rested on his shoulder. Warm, familiar, steady. That touch did something to him. It loosened something tight in his chest. It reminded him, in a simple, wordless way, that he was still here. "Morning," Hermione said, her voice a little rough from dreams. Ron glanced up. "Morning," he answered. Their eyes met, and it wasn't a dramatic moment. It didn't feel like the books Hermione used to read where lovers recognized each other with thunder and certainty. It felt quiet. It felt tired. It felt real. In that look was a conversation they'd been having ever since the battle ended. "Are you all right?" "Not really. Me neither. But we're here. We're alive. That has to mean something." Hermione poured herself tea from the perpetually warm pot. And for a moment, Ron watched her hands, the way she moved, the way her fingers wrapped around the mug. Those hands had held a wand through a war. Those hands had pulled him back from fear more times than he could count. Those hands had been trembling when they buried people they loved. And now, those hands were making tea like life was normal again. Outside the kitchen window, the garden gnomes chittered in the vegetable patch, oblivious as ever. An owl cut across the pale morning sky, wings silent, carrying some new scrap of news from a ministry that was still learning how to function without corruption in its bones. The wireless in the corner played a bright, cheerful song, Celestina Warbeck crooning something light and romantic. It felt strange, like laughter in a room where someone had just finished crying. But it was there all the same, like the world insisting it would go on, whether they were ready or not. Molly Weasley bustled in with a tray of fresh bread, her movements brisk, practiced, determined. There were shadows under her eyes. Her face was tighter than it used to be. But she had chosen something each morning since the funeral, and she chose it again now, to keep doing the small things, because the small things were the only way the big things became survivable. "You two are up early," she said, though it wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, spoken with the careful gentleness of someone who knew sleep had been difficult for everyone in this house. Hermione accepted a slice of bread with a grateful nod. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Too much on my mind." Ron didn't say anything, because the truth was he could have said the same, and so could Molly, and so could Arthur, upstairs, and so could George, in the room that used to hold 2 boys instead of 1. There was always too much on their minds now. The future had arrived, and it was enormous. During the war, tomorrow had been a victory all by itself. You woke up, you breathed, you kept moving. You survived to see another sunrise. That had been enough. Now survival wasn't the goal. Now it was only the beginning. The world was asking them what came next. And the answer wasn't obvious. Ron's letter from the Aurora office sat folded in his pocket, like it was heavier than paper had any right to be. It had come 3 days ago, crisp and official, sealed with a ministry stamp that felt newly honest under Kingsley Shacklebolt. They wanted him. They wanted him despite his missing NEWTs, despite his age, despite the fact that he'd never been the sort of person teachers expected greatness from. The war had proven him in a way exams never could. Harry had received the same offer, and Kingsley had written personally, explaining that the department needed people who had stared into true darkness and kept their footing. "They need heroes," Kingsley had written. The word still made Ron uncomfortable. It made his ears burn. It made him want to argue and joke and change the subject. And yet, somewhere under the embarrassment, there was something else, something quiet. Pride. Hermione, meanwhile, was being pulled in 3 different directions, as if the ministry itself didn't know where to place someone like her. Magical law enforcement wanted her mind, her ability to see patterns and weaknesses in systems. The Department of Magical Education wanted her to help rebuild Hogwarts, to reshape curriculum after everything they'd learned about what ignorance allowed. But it was the Department of Magical Law that had lit a fire in her eyes. Ron had seen that fire before. He'd seen it in the library when she refused to give up on a problem. He'd seen it when she fought for house elves, even when no one wanted to hear it. He'd seen it when she stood between Harry and the world, fierce and unyielding, and refused to be moved. "They're rewriting legislation," she told Ron one night, by the pond behind the burrow, their fingers intertwined, stars bright above them. "They want new protections for Muggle-borns, new restrictions on dark artifacts, new definitions of what counts as dark magic. Ron, they want to rebuild everything. We can make it better. We can make it fair." Her passion had been beautiful. It had also been a little frightening, because when Hermione Granger decided to change the world, she didn't do it halfway. But Ron had something else sitting in his chest these days, alongside hope and pride and fear, something that tugged at him whenever he heard laughter and realized one voice was missing: Fred. Fred's absence lived in this house the way winter lived in a stone wall. Quiet, constant, impossible to ignore. His empty chair wasn't just empty furniture. It was a wound that everyone stepped around without speaking. George had been moving like a ghost since the funeral, not always crying, sometimes the opposite, too calm, too quiet, as if his mind had sealed itself shut to survive. Weasley's wizard wheezes sat dark and shuttered in Diagon Alley. The place had been Fred and George's masterpiece, bright, noisy, ridiculous, alive. Now it waited. Molly had gone once, gathering a few things from the upstairs flat. She'd come home, pale and shaking, and would not describe what it felt like to stand in that shop, full of laughter in her memory, and hear only silence. Ron had suggested, carefully, gently, that maybe George should sell it, that maybe it was too painful, that maybe it would be easier to let the shop become a memory instead of a daily reminder. George had looked at him with hollow eyes. "It's all I have left of him," he'd said. "The shop. The dream we built. I can't let it die too." But the truth was simple, even if it hurt. George couldn't do it alone. The shop had never been one person. It had always been two minds, two hands, two voices talking over each other, completing each other's sentences, making magic out of mischief. How did you keep going when half of your world was in the ground? These thoughts circled Ron's mind as he sat in the kitchen that morning, watching Hermione spread jam on her bread, watching his mother move, as if strength could be built from routine, watching dust motes float in sunlight that felt too bright for grief. "I need to talk to you," Hermione said suddenly, setting her bread down. Her voice had that careful steadiness Ron recognized, like she'd been rehearsing the words in her head. "Both of you, actually. Mrs. Weasley, would you sit for a moment?" Molly lowered herself into a chair, hands smoothing her apron out of habit, face arranging itself into patient attention. The expression mothers wore when they sensed something important. Hermione took a breath, and Ron felt his own shoulders tighten, instinctively bracing for news. "I've accepted the position," Hermione said, "with the Department of Magical Law. I start Monday." For a heartbeat, the kitchen went still. Then Molly's face softened with genuine warmth. "Oh, Hermione, that's wonderful." Hermione nodded, but Ron could see the weight behind her eyes. Not doubt about the choice. Hermione didn't doubt choices like this, but awareness. Awareness of what it would require. "They want me working on the new equality legislation," Hermione continued. "Muggle-born protections, employment reform, the whole framework. It's everything I've been fighting for." "You'll be brilliant," Molly said at once. And it wasn't flattery. It was certainty. "You'll change things." "I'll try," Hermione said quietly. Then, under the table, her hand found Ron's and held tight. "But it means long hours, really long hours, at least at first. There's so much to fix." Ron squeezed her fingers back, pride and fear threading together in his chest, like two vines twisting around the same stake. "You'll do it," he said, voice low. "You'll make a difference." Hermione turned to him, eyes searching. "And you?" The question hung between them like an unanswered letter. "Have you decided about the Auror office?" Ron stared down at their joined hands, at the old scars on his knuckles and the newer ones that lived under his sleeves. He thought of the letter in his pocket. He thought of Harry's face in the dark. He thought of George's empty gaze and his mother's quiet strength. "I want to," Ron said slowly. "I do." Molly's eyes glistened because she knew what it meant to want that kind of job now. She knew what it asked of the people who took it. Ron swallowed, forcing the next words out. "But George—" Molly didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The name said everything. "He needs help," Ron continued. He can't do it by himself. The shop, it's like Fred died twice. Once at Hogwarts, and then again every day that shop stays shut." Hermione's grip tightened, as if she was trying to hold him steady through the words. "So what are you thinking?" she asked. Ron's plan formed as he spoke, half idea and half desperate hope. I'm thinking maybe I can do both, he said. At least for a while. Aurora training is part-time at first, isn't it? Evenings, weekends. I could help George in the day, get the shop running again. Then, when he's steadier, when he's when he's breathing again, I can go full-time with the auras. Molly's eyes filled, and this time the tears looked like gratitude and pain tangled together. Ron, she whispered. He's my brother, Ron said simply, as if that explained everything. And in a way it did. He didn't say the rest out loud, but it was there in the kitchen like a fourth presence. Fred would have done it, without hesitation, for any of them. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its hands no longer pointing constantly to mortal peril, but still bearing the scars of that time. Most of the little hands hovered near home now. One, however, never moved again. Molly had left it pointing at Fred's face, because she couldn't bear to erase even that. Hermione drew a slow breath. It means we won't see much of each other, she said carefully. Ron heard the fear under her calm voice. They had spent so long moving as one unit, fighting, fleeing, surviving, clinging to each other in the only ways they could. Separate schedules and separate paths felt like a new kind of battlefield, one without clear rules. We'll make it work, Ron said, putting more confidence into his voice than he felt. You'll come back to the Burrow on weekends. I'll visit you in London when I can. We've survived worse than busy calendars, haven't we? Hermione smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. We have, she agreed softly. We've survived much worse. And they had, dear listener. They had survived nightmares made real. Surely they could survive the quiet. Surely love that had endured Horcruxes could endure the strain of ordinary life. Surely the days that followed moved too quickly, the way time does when you're racing toward a change you aren't fully ready for. Hermione prepared as only Hermione could, reading until her eyes ached, filling notebooks with arguments and counter-arguments, mapping the ministry's tangled legal history as if she could untie it with sheer precision. Ron watched her with admiration, and with a growing, wordless worry that he couldn't quite name, because the look in her eyes, the fire, the focus, was the same look she'd worn in the war. And he knew what it cost her when she lived like that. Meanwhile, Ron prepared in his own way. Not with books, but with decisions. He went to Diagon Alley on a Tuesday afternoon, apparating behind the dark shop, with his heart hammering as if he were walking into battle instead of a joke shop. He hadn't been here since before Hogwarts fell and rose again, before Fred died, before laughter became something sharp. The back door opened, and George stood there, thin and pale, hair cut short, face drawn in a way that made him look older than Ron remembered. Ron, George said, and for a moment there was something like relief in his expression, as if Ron's presence proved the world hadn't completely come apart. What are you doing here? Ron forced his voice light, careful, as if humor could make this less painful. Thought you might need a hand, he said. I heard there's a joke shop around here that's been getting a bit lazy. George's face shifted. Denial, hope, grief, gratitude. Too many emotions crossing too quickly. You don't have to, George said, voice flat with exhaustion. I know, Ron replied gently. I want to. He held George's gaze. Let me help. Let me be here. And in that quiet doorway, in the shadow of a shop that had once been a bright, impossible dream, Ron Weasley stepped into his brother's grief and made a choice. Not a grand, heroic choice. A small, stubborn, human one. I'll carry this with you. You don't have to do it alone. The shop felt like a place that had been holding its breath. Ron noticed it the moment he stepped inside Weasley's wizard wheezes. Not the look of it, not the dusty shelves or the dim light, but the feeling. The air itself seemed paused, as if the building had been waiting for permission to live again. The scent was Ron, too. Not the sharp, bright, chaotic mixture Ron remembered from childhood visits. Peppermint and smoke and sugar, singed cloth from exploded prototypes, the faint tang of fireworks and mischief. This smelled like old wood and stale magic, like laughter that had dried on the walls and flaked away. Morning light slanted through the tall front windows, catching dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. The displays were still arranged in the twin style, neat enough to function, messy enough to feel alive. Except it didn't feel alive. It felt like a museum of itself. Ron's eyes flicked automatically over familiar things. The you-know-poo display, the skiving snack boxes, the little handwritten signs with jokes that always made customers snort, the space where pygmy puffs had once squeaked and rolled and nested in piles of fluffy color, now empty, small beds waiting in a quiet glass case. And on the counter, right where it had been left, was a half-finished prototype, a wand meant to burst into a bouquet of flowers. The charm was incomplete, so it only produced a sickly, wilting cluster of petals if you tapped it wrong. Ron stared at it for a moment longer than he meant to. It wasn't just a product. It was proof of a moment frozen in time. Proof that one ordinary day had ended and nothing had ever been ordinary again. George stood in the middle of the shop floor, turning slowly in a circle, like a man trying to remember where he'd been standing before his life split in half. His eyes moved over the shelves and the windows and the staircase to the flat above. "It's bigger than I remembered," George said quietly. Ron understood the real word he meant. Emptier. The shop had never felt big when Fred was in it. Fred had filled spaces. Fred had filled people. He had filled the air with noise, with ideas, with a constant sense that something ridiculous and brilliant might happen at any second. Now the silence made the place feel cathedral-wide. Every corner an echo chamber for laughter that used to live here. Ron swallowed and kept his voice gentle. "Where do we start?" George blinked, as if he'd been somewhere far away, and Ron's words pulled him back. "Inventory," he said. "I suppose. We need to see what's left. What's still good? What's gone off?" He moved toward the back room, footsteps hollow on the wooden floor. "Fred always did stock," George added, almost like he was explaining a fact to himself. "Said I was too impatient. Said I always wanted to jump straight to making new things instead of counting what we already had." The back room was worse. It was worse because it wasn't a shop. It wasn't a place for customers. It was the heart of the operation. It was where ideas lived before they became products. It was where Fred and George had built a world out of chaos and cleverness. And it was full of unfinished conversations. Cauldrons sat on work tables, residue dried into crusty rings. Jars of ingredients waited, labels written in that quick, messy scrawl that made Ron's throat tighten, because it looked too much like Fred's handwriting. Notebooks lay stacked and scattered, opened to pages full of sketches and notes and half-formed jokes. A corkboard covered one wall, pinned with bits of parchment. Reminders, inventions, pricing ideas. A strange little drawing of a dragon wearing a top hat. Some notes were in George's hand. Some were in Fred's. Together they formed a dialogue between two minds that had always spoken in tandem. George reached for one of the notebooks and lifted it like it was fragile. His fingers traced the writing on the first page. Ron watched the grief move across his brother's face like weather, like a shadow passing over sun. He had this idea, George said softly. His voice was so quiet that Ron had to lean in to hear. Right before everything, a product that lets you experience your happiest memory whenever you want. Like a pensieve, but portable, personal. George swallowed. He called them Euphoria Echoes. Said people would need them after the war. Said, said everyone would need help remembering how to be happy again. Ron's chest tightened. That's brilliant, he managed. George gave a small, broken nod. It was. He was. He set the notebook down carefully, like he was placing something sacred back in its resting place. They worked without talking for a while. Ron took inventory with a quill and parchment, writing down what he saw. It was strangely grounding, the simple act of counting and noting and making lists. It felt like doing something practical in a place that wanted to swallow you with memories. George moved around the back room sorting ingredients, testing jars, checking charms. His motions were mechanical, like a man borrowing his own body. Ron noticed patterns as he worked. The shop wasn't organized like any normal business. Ingredients weren't sorted alphabetically. Finished products weren't arranged by price. Everything was arranged by a kind of logic that only made sense if you understood Fred and George's minds. The prank potential system, Ron thought privately. The shelves near the door held things designed for quick laughs. The deeper shelves held things meant for longer schemes. Ingredients were arranged by color, scent, and likelihood of causing chaos in a classroom. It was mad. It was perfect, and now it was up to George to keep it alive. We need to restock, Ron said eventually, staring at the growing list. Most of the popular stuff is gone. Portable swamps nearly out. Skiving snack boxes down to, 3 boxes? Decoy detonators, maybe a dozen left. George didn't look surprised. He just nodded, as if he'd known this would be the result before they ever started. We haven't made anything new since January, he said. The way he said it made Ron's stomach tighten. January had been when George had come back from running, from hiding, from fighting, from that strange, brutal time when every day was survival and the future felt like a myth. George didn't say the rest of the sentence, but it hung between them anyway. Since I came back, and he didn't. Can you still make them? Ron asked, careful, as if his words were stepping over broken glass. The products, I mean. George's eyes flicked up to him, and Ron saw the pain flash sharp. Without Fred? George said flatly. He let out a breath, slow and thin. I don't know, Ron. We always did it together. He'd have an idea. I'd refine it. Or I'd start something and he'd fix the charm. Even our magic worked better together. Twin magic, people called it. George's gaze slid away, unfocused. Mum said we were doing synchronized spell work before we could properly talk. Ron remembered suddenly being very small and watching his older brothers in the garden, their wands moving like mirrors, their laughter loud enough to scare the gnomes. The way spells seemed to snap into place, easier for them than for anyone else. Ron had always thought they were the most magical people he knew. Maybe that's true, Ron said quietly. Maybe you were stronger together. But George, you're still brilliant. Fred would hate seeing it like this. George's jaw clenched. Fred's not here to see anything. No, Ron agreed softly, but I am. And I'm rubbish at inventing. I can't brew a decent potion to save my life. But I can measure ingredients. I can test. I can man the shop. I can be here. He hesitated, because the next words would hurt, but they were true. I can be your second pair of hands. Not his. Mine. George stared at him for a long moment. His eyes, so like Fred's, so painfully like Fred's, searched Ron's face as if looking for any sign of pity or pressure. Ron held steady. Finally, something in George's expression cracked just slightly, a seam of resistance loosening. "All right," George said. "All right, little brother. Let's try." They started with something simple, skiving snack boxes. George knew the recipe by heart. He'd made thousands of them. He moved around the room, gathering ingredients: Balgadoc's powder for the fainting fancies, dried billywig stings for the fever fudge, Alahootsie leaves for the nosebleed nougat. Ron watched, trying to memorize, trying to learn the rhythm of it. George's hands moved with muscle memory, wand, conducting a quiet symphony of heating and cooling. For a moment, just a moment, the haunted look faded from his face. This was familiar. This was home. Fred always did the puking pastilles, George said, stirring a cauldron of something that smelled disturbingly like sour milk and regret. Said he had a stronger stomach. He snorted softly, and it almost sounded like his old laugh, which was rubbish. I just let him do it because he enjoyed grossing people out more than I did. Ron felt the corner of his mouth lift despite everything. Remember when he tested the first batch on Percy? George's eyes brightened briefly. Percy was furious, he said. And there it was, a flicker of the old grin, sharp as starlight. Puked all over his head boy badge. Fred laughed so hard he couldn't breathe. Said it was the best moment of his life. The memory hung between them, precious and painful. George's smile faded, but he didn't stop stirring. He kept going. Ron counted that as a victory. They worked through the morning. The shop slowly began to smell less like dust and more like potion steam. It was a small change, but it made Ron's chest ache with something like hope. George taught him little things: how to chop shriveled fig roots so they released their essence properly, how to tell when a mixture was ready by the way the steam curled, how to test a product safely. Well, as safely as anything created by the Weasley twins could ever be tested. "The trick," George said, carefully pouring purple liquid into small molds, "is balance. Enough illness to be believable. Enough cure to be temporary. Too much illness and people actually get sick. Too much cure and it doesn't work as an excuse." Ron watched the mixture harden into neat orange squares. "How do you test them?" George's expression turned sly. "Very carefully, and with a lot of trial and error. Fred and I used to test everything on ourselves first. Ended up in St. Mungo's more than once." Ron could imagine it too easily. Two teenage boys brilliant enough to invent magic and reckless enough to poison themselves in the name of comedy. "Mum nearly killed us," George added, as if reading Ron's mind. By noon, they had produced 50 skiving snack boxes, packaged and stacked neatly. George stared at them like he couldn't quite believe they existed. "We did it," Ron said softly. George swallowed. "We did," he agreed, voice holding something like wonder. Like surprise. Like a man who had thought part of him had died too, and was now watching it breathe. They conjured sandwiches for lunch, because neither of them had remembered food. They ate, sitting on the shop floor with their backs against the counter, looking out through the windows at Diagon Alley. People were beginning to return, slowly, cautiously, like animals, testing whether a forest was safe after a fire. A witch walked past carrying a bag from Flourish and Blots. A father held his child's hand and pointed up at Gringotts, as if reminding them that the world was still full of marvels. Life kept going, dear listener, even when hearts begged it to pause. "Tell me about Aurora training," George said suddenly, as if changing the subject before grief swallowed them again. What's it like? Ron swallowed a bite of sandwich, thinking. Intense, he admitted. They're not messing around. Even though most of us fought, they're training us properly. Tracking spells, defensive protocols, magical law, interrogation techniques. He hesitated, then added honestly, "It's good, actually. It feels like we're building something. Like the war meant something." George nodded slowly, absorbing this. "And Hermione?" he asked. "Careful. How's the ministry treating her?" Ron's expression clouded. "She's working too hard," he said. "She came home past midnight last night and started talking about some law from the 1600s that still classifies Muggleborns as anomalies. She's fighting the whole system, George. You know her. She won't stop until she wins." George's gaze dropped to his hands. "Sounds familiar," he said quietly. Fred was like that about the shop. Couldn't stop inventing, couldn't stop improving. Drove himself mad sometimes trying to make everything perfect. They fell silent again. Outside, an owl swooped by, carrying someone's mail. A soft breeze stirred the banner above the doorway, still folded, still waiting, like even the fabric wasn't ready to announce the shop's return. "Do you think it gets easier?" George asked, voice barely above a whisper. Missing him. Ron could have lied. He could have offered easy comfort. But George deserved truth. "I don't know," Ron admitted. "But I think maybe the missing becomes part of you instead of being all of you. Like you carry it, but it doesn't crush you every second." George nodded slowly. "I talk to him sometimes," he confessed. "Fred, when I'm working, I tell him what I'm doing. Ask what he'd think. Is that mad? That's love." The afternoon moved more easily after that, as if saying the word love out loud gave them permission to keep going. They dusted shelves, polished glass, restocked what they could. George opened the curtains wider, letting sunlight spill in. The effect was immediate. The shop looked less like a tomb and more like a place that could, someday, hold laughter again. Ron found himself strangely good at arranging displays. He built a neat little pyramid of decoy detonators that caught the eye. He lined up skiving snack boxes with labels, facing out like Hermione arranging books by spine. "You're good at this," George observed, watching him. "The shop stuff. Better than I expected." Ron shot him a look. "Don't sound so shocked." George's mouth twitched. "I've been watching you and Fred my whole life," Ron said. Something must have sunk in. George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, almost too softly to hear, "Fred would have liked having you here." Ron felt his throat tighten. "He always said you were braver than you gave yourself credit for." George continued, "Smarter, too." Ron stared down at the products in his hands because looking at George's face might have been too much. "Fred always saw the best in people," Ron managed, voice rough, "even when they couldn't see it themselves." As the sun began to sink, Diagon Alley turned honey gold. George stood at the window, looking out as if measuring the street, the world, the risk of stepping back into it. "Tomorrow," he said slowly, "I think we should open, just for a few hours. See if anyone remembers. See if anyone still wants what we sell." Ron felt a surge of pride so sharp it almost hurt. "You sure you're ready?" George let out a short, humorless laugh. "No," he admitted, "but I don't think I ever will be, so I might as well do it anyway." His gaze stayed on the street. "That's what Fred would say," he added quietly. "If you're going to fail, George, fail spectacularly." Sounds like him. George's voice dropped even further. "Everything sounds like him if I listen hard enough." They locked up the shop as night fell. George stood on the doorstep looking back at what they'd done. The clean shelves, the restocked displays, the first small signs of life returning. "Thank you," he said, not looking at Ron. "For today, for being here, for understanding." "Always," Ron replied simply. "That's what brothers do." Then they parted. George upstairs to the flat, Ron back to the burrow. Ron apparated into the garden. Just as full darkness settled, warm light glowed from the windows, and the scent of dinner reached him like a hand pulling him toward home. Inside, he found another note waiting on the kitchen table in Hermione's neat handwriting. "Working late again. Don't wait up. Love you." Ron stared at the note for a long moment. He told himself it was fine. This was what they'd chosen. This was how they would rebuild the world. But as he climbed the stairs, passing Fred's closed door, passing George's empty room at the burrow that still didn't feel real, he felt something settle in his chest. Not anger, not resentment, just a quiet loneliness he hadn't felt in years. Not since the war had forced them together so tightly that separation felt impossible. "We'll make it work," he'd promised. Ron Weasley had never liked breaking promises. He only hoped the world would give them a chance to keep this one. The weeks that followed didn't feel like weeks at all. They felt like fragments, pieces of days, stitched together by routine and exhaustion, moments swallowed by urgency, hours lost to work that mattered, and grief that didn't care how busy you were. If Ron had been asked months ago what peace would look like after the war, he might have imagined something simple: sleeping through the night, laughing without flinching, eating dinner without listening for footsteps outside the door, waking up to a world that felt steady again. Instead, peace arrived like a crowded room. Too many needs, too many expectations, too much unfinished. Hermione's new job consumed her the way a fire consumes dry wood. Quickly, completely, with no hesitation and no apology. Ron admired it in her, always had. Her devotion, her brilliance, the way she could look at a broken system and see not only what was wrong, but how to fix it. But admiration could sit beside worry. And lately, Ron carried both. The ministry didn't rebuild itself gently. It rebuilt itself with arguments and deadlines and endless parchment. It rebuilt itself with committees full of people who'd always benefited from the old order and weren't eager to let it go. Hermione came home smelling of ink and candle smoke. She spoke in the language of legislation now, statutes and precedents and amendments, as if the war had simply traded one battlefield for another. Ron, meanwhile, lived in two worlds. By day, he was in Diagon Alley, unlocking the back door of Weasley's wizard wheezes, and stepping into that strange, painful space where Fred felt both absent and everywhere. He worked beside George, measuring ingredients, testing prototypes, cleaning shelves, and slowly, steadily, helping his brother remember how to exist. By evening, Ron became someone else. He took the flu to the ministry for oral training, stepping out of green flames into stone corridors that still smelled faintly of smoke from the final battle. He joined a room full of young witches and wizards, most of them survivors too, each carrying their own invisible scars. They learned how to track, how to restrain, how to protect. They learned the difference between stunning someone and ending them. They learned law and protocol and how to keep your breathing steady when someone raised a wand at your throat. Williamson, their supervising Auror, did not speak to them like children. He spoke to them like people who had already seen death and might see it again. Courage isn't the same as recklessness, he told them on the first night, pacing slowly in front of the group. A dead Auror saves no one. You lot survived the war, and that means you know something most people never have to learn. Fear doesn't stop you if you keep moving anyway. But survival also means thinking, planning, working as a unit. If you think heroics make you invincible, you'll be the first one buried. Ron listened. Harry listened. They all listened, because none of them had the luxury of pretending they were unbreakable. Kingsley Shacklebolt came once to address the new intake. He stood at the front of the room, tall and calm, wearing authority the way some people wore warmth. "You've already proven yourselves," Kingsley said. "Not in exams, not in tidy theoretical lessons. In reality, in the mess, in the terror, in the choices that cost." He let that settle. "The world you've inherited is wounded," he continued. "Some people think the war ended when Voldemort fell. They're wrong. It ended when we stopped the rot that let him rise. It ends when we make it harder for darkness to grow." He looked at Ron directly for a moment, and Ron had the strange sensation of being seen. "We don't need dead heroes," Kingsley said quietly. "We need living protectors." The words stayed with Ron as he trudged home past midnight, exhausted enough to feel hollow. The burrow was dark when he arrived, except for a single lamp glowing in Molly's room. She always waited up on nights she knew he was training. Always. As if sleep wasn't allowed until she knew her son was safely home. Ron hated what the war had done to her. Hated that even in peace, she still lived with fear. In the kitchen, he found a note propped against the teapot. "Working late. Lost track of time. Don't wait up. Love you." He stared at it, then sank slowly into a chair, as if his bones were heavier than they should be. They were doing good work, both of them. They were trying to build the world they'd fought for. So why did it feel like everything was slipping through their fingers? On the second Thursday after Hermione started, Ron realized he couldn't remember the last time they'd sat and talked, without time pressing on the edges of the conversation, without one of them glancing toward a clock, without a list of duties waiting like a queue outside the door. They were always almost together. Almost. "Ships passing in the night," Molly said once, voice gentle but sad, when Hermione arrived home just as Ron was leaving. Ron laughed it off at the time. Now the phrase sat in his chest like a stone. At the shop, George moved with more purpose each day. That was the bright spot. The one place where progress felt visible, where the work resulted in something you could touch and see and sell to a child whose laughter came easy. They reopened quietly at first. A few hours in the afternoon. A simple sign hung in the window. People drifted in cautiously, as if unsure whether it was appropriate to laugh yet. But laughter, Ron discovered, was not something people let go of easily. The first day they opened, 2 children came in with their mother, eyes wide and eager. They stared at the shelves like it was a treasure vault. George demonstrated a decoy detonator, and when it whizzed around the room with hilarious dramatic shrieking, the children dissolved into giggles, so pure and unrestrained that Ron felt a sudden sting behind his eyes. The second day, more people came. A group of Hogwarts students whose parents had survived the battle. 2 older witches who said they used to come in before everything went bad and wanted to see the place again. A man with haunted eyes who bought a skiving snack box and muttered, almost to himself, "I just want to feel normal for 5 minutes." George handled them like he'd been born behind that counter. His voice grew stronger as he spoke. His gestures grew more confident. His eyes still carried grief, but now they carried something else, too. Purpose. One afternoon, during a brief lull, Ron was restocking shelves when George leaned on the counter and said quietly, "Sometimes I forget." Ron looked up. When I'm explaining something to a customer, George continued, staring at the window, or when I'm showing a kid how a product works, for a moment, I'll turn to say something to Fred, like he's right there, like he's about to roll his eyes and call me dramatic. His voice wavered slightly. And then, I remember, Ron didn't know what to say. There were no words that fixed that. So he said the simplest truth. That means he's still part of it, Ron replied. Part of you. Part of this place. George's jaw clenched. I don't want to forget him, he said, almost fiercely. Not even for a second. You won't, Ron promised. But maybe it can hurt less. George looked at him then, really looked. When did you get so grown up? George asked. Ron huffed out a breath that might have been a laugh. Probably around the time I helped destroy bits of Voldemort's soul, he said. Does strange things to your perspective. George's mouth twitched. Yeah, he said softly. That'll do it. That same evening, Ron's Auror training shifted into something sharper. Williamson entered the room with a stack of files and a grim expression that silenced the chatter immediately. We've got a tip, he said. A suspected gathering point in Nocturne Alley. Possible Death Eater sympathizers. Possible illegal artifacts. We're not calling it a raid yet, but we're investigating. The word Death Eater still made Ron's stomach tighten, even after everything, even with Voldemort gone. Darkness didn't vanish. It scattered, and scattered things were harder to predict. They went that night. Not as full auras, as trainees paired with experienced officers. Nocturne Alley was colder than Diagon Alley, shadows thicker. The air tasted wrong, like old curses clinging to brick. Ron crouched behind a stack of crates, wand drawn, breath controlled. Beside him, Harry waited with that tense stillness Ron knew too well. Behind them, other trainees and Williamson kept watch. Ron could feel the wards on the abandoned building ahead, dark magic laced into them like thorns. Someone was using something they shouldn't. It could be nothing, Williamson muttered. Illegal potions, smugglers. Ron didn't take his eyes off the door. It's something, he murmured. I can feel it. And then the world erupted. The back door blasted outward in a burst of violet light. Ron threw up a shield on instinct, the impact shuddering through his arm like a physical blow. 3 figures in dark robes burst into the alley. Wands already spitting curses. Spells crisscrossed the darkness, sharp as lightning. Shouts, footsteps, the crack of apparition, the smell of burnt stone. Ron moved on, training and memory, and something deeper, something the war had carved into him. His body remembered how to fight even when his mind lagged behind. Stupefy, Expelliarmus, Protego. One robed figure went down. Another's wand flew into the shadows. The third turned and sprinted, breathing ragged, trying to disapparate. Ron's legs carried him forward without thought. He chased, closing the distance, heart pounding, wand steady. The robed figure swung around, panic and fury flashing beneath the hood. A flash of green, Avada Kedavra. Ron didn't have time to think. He dove sideways, the killing curse slicing through the air where his chest had been. He hit the cobblestones hard, pain jolting up his ribs, but he rolled and came up with his wand already raised. The fear in him turned cold, not freezing. Focusing. They weren't just sympathizers. They weren't frightened stragglers. They were Death Eaters, or close enough. They were willing to kill. Incarcerous. Harry's voice rang out, rope snapping into place around 2 of the figures. Ron sprinted again, chasing the last one deeper into the alley. "Stupefy!" he roared. The spell hit the figure square in the back. They crumpled onto the stones, unconscious before they could vanish. Silence fell abruptly, as if the alley itself was stunned. Ron stood over the fallen figure, chest heaving, wand pointed down. His hands were trembling, not from fear, exactly. From adrenaline, from the sick, familiar realization that even in peace, he could still die in an alley for the sake of stopping darkness. Williamson clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Good work, Weasley," he said. "Textbook pursuit." Ron nodded, unable to find words. They processed the prisoners at the ministry. They filled out reports, secured seized objects, and catalogued cursed items that made Ron's skin crawl. Paperwork, Ron thought sourly. The great enemy of any heroic dream. By the time he was released, it was past midnight again. He apparated back to the burrow, landing in the garden with legs that felt like lead. Inside the house, the kitchen was quiet. A note waited for him. "Working late again, don't wait up. Love you." Ron stood there for a long moment staring at Hermione's handwriting. He loved her. He loved her with a loyalty that was almost painful. She was his best friend, his anchor, the brightest force in his life. But the quiet between them was growing. Not because they didn't care, because they cared about too many things and cared about them fiercely. He folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket, like it mattered enough to keep close. Then he went upstairs, stepped into his room, and sat on the edge of the bed without undressing. The ceiling still held a charm Hermione had cast years ago. Tiny constellations glowing softly in the dark. Stars that didn't move, that didn't change, that didn't demand anything of him. Ron stared at those stars and felt something unfamiliar and heavy settle over him. A fear that wasn't about Death Eaters. A fear that somehow, quietly without meaning to, they might lose each other. Not in a dramatic moment, not in a burst of green light, but in slow drift, in missed dinners, in postponed Sundays, in "love you," scribbled on notes instead of spoken out loud. He lay down fully clothed, wand still in his hand, and forced himself to breathe slowly. "We'll make it work," he whispered into the dark, as if saying it again could make it truer. And somewhere across London, Hermione Granger sat under the cold lights of the Wizengamot chamber, learning what it meant to fight a different kind of darkness. Hermione noticed the cold before she noticed anything else. Every morning, when she stepped through the heavy doors of the Wizengamot chamber, the temperature seemed to drop in a way that felt intentional. The ministry had enchanted warmth in its corridors and offices, but down here, in this ancient room of stone and tradition, the air carried a chill that sank into your wrists and the back of your neck. It was not the kind of cold that came from weather. It was the kind that came from history. The chamber was built to make people feel small. High ceilings swallowed sound and turned voices into echoes. Tiered seats rose in sharp arcs like a tribunal, and the bench where the chief warlock sat was elevated just enough to remind everyone where authority lived. The walls held centuries of law, and in those centuries were the quieter things that law carried: prejudice, fear, protection for the powerful, rules that looked tidy in ink but cut deeply in practice. Hermione sat at the advocate's bench reserved for junior staff and petitioners, her arms full of files, her quill tucked into her sleeve like a familiar weapon. She could feel eyes on her even before anyone spoke. Some were curious, some wary, some openly hostile. She was 20. She was Muggle-born. She was standing in a room where people like her had once been told they didn't belong, and she was not here to ask permission. The members filed in slowly, robes brushing stone. Many were old families, names spoken with the casual assumption of importance. Some had survived the war by claiming neutrality, by claiming ignorance, by claiming the imperious curse after the fact. A few, blessedly few, were reformers who had backed Kingsley and meant it. But most felt like the old order, wearing new robes. Hermione kept her face calm. She kept her hands steady. She held her composure the way she held her wand in battle. Not with bravado, but with focus. "Miss Granger," intoned Tiberius Ogden, his voice careful, neutral in the practiced way of someone who had learned to survive in a room full of pride. "You wish to address the Assembly regarding Proposal 47B, the Magical Heritage Equality Act." Hermione rose. She smoothed her formal robes, felt the weight of the chamber settle around her like a cloak, and drew one slow breath. She reminded herself that fear did not mean stop. Fear meant proceed carefully. "Honored members of the Wisengamot," she began, and her voice carried farther than she expected. Clear, steady. "I come before you today to propose the abolition of 17 archaic statutes that classify Muggle-born witches and wizards as legally inferior to those born into magical families." She let the words sit. She watched the small movements in the tiered seats, a sneer forming, a glance exchanged, a brow lifting in dismissive amusement. She did not flinch. "These laws," Hermione continued, "some dating back to the 15th century, establish a framework of institutional discrimination. They grant the ministry powers over Muggle-born citizens that it does not hold over anyone else. They allow bias in employment and education. They codify the idea that blood determines worth." A murmur rippled through the chamber. A few voices rose, quickly hushed again. Hermione turned a page in her file with deliberate calm. "For example," she said, "the Magical Anomaly Classification Act of 1692 still designates Muggle-borns as aberrations of natural magical order. It grants the Ministry the legal authority to monitor our magical development under the guise of public safety." A hand lifted in the upper tier, and an old witch's voice cut through. "These laws were created in different times," Griselda Marchbanks said, her tone sharp with indignation. "They reflect the concerns and customs of their era. One cannot simply sweep away centuries of precedent because modern sensibilities feel uncomfortable." Hermione looked directly at her. "With respect, Madam Marchbanks," she replied, careful but firm, "these laws were created to oppress. They were wrong when written, and they remain wrong now. Tradition does not transform injustice into virtue." A few gasps, some scoffing laughter, a hissed insult from somewhere above that Hermione did not dignify with attention. She continued, "The Pure Blood Priority Employment Act of 1754 legally permits employers to favor pureblood applicants over equally qualified Muggle-borns. The Heritage Verification Statute of 1811 requires Muggle-born children to submit to mandatory heritage testing that pureblood children are exempt from." Hermione paused again. She could feel the room straining against her presence, as if the chamber itself disliked hearing these laws spoken aloud. She held her ground. "The recent war proved that magical ability is not determined by blood," she said. "Some of our bravest defenders were Muggle-born. Some of our darkest criminals were pureblood. The ideology of blood supremacy has been defeated in battle. It cannot be permitted to survive in our legal foundation." "How dare you?" someone hissed from the upper tiers. Hermione's stomach tightened, but her voice did not waver. "I dare," she said quietly, and in that soft tone was a steel that made the chamber go still for a heartbeat, "because I am one of the people these laws were designed to diminish." because I fought in a war to end blood supremacy, and I will not stand by while the legal system preserves the very logic we spilled blood to destroy." The room erupted. It was not a dramatic shout all at once. It was a swell argument rising like a storm, voices layered over one another, outrage, mockery, concern, reluctant respect, anger disguised as principled debate. Hermione stood and listened, letting it wash over her, because she had learned something during the war. You didn't stop a wave by panicking at it. You rode it. You waited for your moment and moved with purpose. Kingsley Shacklebolt, seated at the Chief Warlock's bench, lifted one hand. His presence quieted the room in a way brute authority never could. It wasn't fear that silenced them. It was the weight of a man who had seen what this chamber's failures had cost. "Order," Kingsley said, voice deep and steady. "Miss Granger's proposal will be reviewed by committee. We will reconvene in 1 week to debate its merits. This session is adjourned." The gavel struck stone. The chamber's noise faded into a low rumble as people gathered their robes and their pride and their centuries-old assumptions. Hermione sat down slowly, hands trembling now that the moment had passed. Not from fear exactly, from adrenaline, from the ache of being 20 years old and standing alone against 1,000 years of legal tradition. She gathered her files, forced her fingers to steady, and walked out with her spine straight. In the corridor beyond, the chill felt less like stone and more like whispers. Mudblood upstart. Thinks she can change everything. Hermione did not turn her head. She did not look for the speaker. She did not give them the satisfaction of knowing they had reached her. But the words still stung, not because she believed them, because she knew how many people in this building still did. Back in her department office, the work swallowed her again. The Department of Magical Law did not sparkle. It did not feel heroic. It was cramped and filled with shelves that bowed under the weight of old books. It smelled of parchment and ink, and the air was always faintly dry, as if the room itself had been drained by the volume of paperwork. Hermione's desk sat wedged between two others. She shared the space with junior advocates who looked at her with a mix of awe and caution, as if unsure whether she was brilliant or reckless. Hermione didn't have time to care. She worked through lunch, quills scratching across fresh parchment as she drafted supplementary arguments. She built her case the way one built a fortress, brick by brick, fact by fact, precedent by precedent. Every time she opened a new law book, she found something else. Another statute that assumed muggle-borns were suspicious. Another guideline that allowed heritage preference. Another historical clause that sounded polite and did violence all the same. Her anger was clean and focused. It made her fast. At 4 in the afternoon, a shadow fell across her desk. "Still here, Granger," said Marcus Whitby. Hermione didn't look up immediately, not because she was rude, but because she was mid-thought and stopping felt like interrupting a spell. Marcus set a cup of tea down beside her papers. It was cold already. He always brought tea, and he always forgot that Hermione didn't pause long enough to drink it properly. "You've been here since before dawn," Marcus said, voice gentle but edged with worry. "Have you eaten?" "I'll eat later," Hermione murmured, flipping a page. "I need to finish this analysis of the 1811 statute. The committee meeting is in 3 days, and I need to be ready for every possible objection." Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The committee meeting can wait 3 hours, while you remember you are a person." Hermione finally looked up, her eyes sharp, then softer when she saw the concern on his face. "There's so much to do," she said quietly. "So much that needs fixing." "I know," Marcus replied. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive. That's exactly why I'm telling you to stop for a moment. You will not fix centuries of injustice in a single week, and you will not help anyone if you burn yourself into ash. Hermione's jaw tightened. I don't have the luxury of resting, she said, and there was something old and raw behind the words. If I slow down, they win by default. They stall, they bury things in committees, they wait for momentum to fade. Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then he asked quietly, like he was stepping carefully across fragile ground, when did you last see Ron? The question hit like a curse. Not painful in the body, but in the heart. Hermione's throat tightened. She blinked hard, furious with herself for the sudden sting of tears. 2 weeks, she admitted. Breakfast at the Burrow, 30 minutes before he left. Marcus sighed. That isn't sustainable. I know, Hermione whispered. The office around her felt suddenly too small. The stacks of books felt like walls. The candlelight felt harsh. The constant hum of ministry magic felt like pressure behind her eyes. What am I supposed to do? She demanded softly. Stop working. Let these laws remain because my personal life is suffering. Muggle-born children are still being treated as second-class citizens, Marcus. People's lives depend on this work. Marcus didn't flinch. He held her gaze steadily. And your life matters too, he said. Your relationship matters too. You are not a machine built to fix the world. You are a witch with a heart. If you break that heart by neglecting it, you will not become a better advocate. You will become a burnt-out ghost, haunting these corridors. Hermione swallowed. She looked back at her notes, at the ink blurring slightly where her eyes were tired. She had been awake for too long. She had been running on determination and resentment and duty. She didn't want to admit it, but Marcus was right. She didn't know how to stop. Across London, at nearly the same hour, Ron Weasley was crouched in the shadowed edge of Nocturne Alley again, wand drawn, breath steady. Not by choice, exactly. By necessity. The tip had come in late afternoon. A suspected remnant cell meeting in an abandoned shop. Williamson had brought trainees as backup. Harry was there too. They were learning, yes, but they were also needed. Needed. That word had become dangerous. Ron's knees ached from crouching. His fingers tightened around his wand. He could feel the faint prickle of dark wards nearby, like invisible nettles against his skin. He listened. Silence. Then a muffled sound. A door creaking. A voice. Williamson lifted 2 fingers. Ready. Ron's heart beat slow and heavy now. Not panicked. Focused. The war had changed fear into something quieter. Then the door exploded outward, and everything went wrong. Ron's shield snapped into place. 3 figures in robes burst out, and the alley became a storm of spells again. Shouts, heat, the crackle of magic slicing through air. Ron moved on instinct. He stunned one, disarmed another. He chased the third. He heard distantly a curse shouted in a voice that sounded too eager. Then green light flashed again. Ron's stomach dropped. A killing curse. He dove, hard, shield thrown up, heart slamming. He felt the curse scrape past his protection like ice along bone. He hit the stones, rolled, came up, and sent his own stunning spell with a roar that tore his throat. The robed figure crumpled, and the alley fell into sudden silence again, except for ragged breathing and the faint hiss of magic dissipating. Good, Williamson said harshly, like praise hurt to give. Good work, but this is escalating. Ron's hands trembled as the adrenaline began to fade. Escalating. That word mattered too, because it meant this wasn't over. because it meant even now, after everything, darkness still had teeth. They'd processed prisoners, filed reports, secured artifacts. And Ron went home again past midnight, exhausted enough to feel like his bones were hollow. The burrow was dark, except for the one window lit upstairs. Molly, waiting. In the kitchen, another note from Hermione. Working late again. Sorry. Love you. Ron stared at the handwriting and felt the distance between them stretch, not in miles, but in hours. They were both doing what was right. So why did it feel like they were slowly disappearing from each other's lives? He folded the note and placed it beside the others he'd kept in his drawer. A small pile now. A collection of love, written in fragments. Then he climbed the stairs, past the closed door that still belonged to Fred in everyone's mind, and lay down under the glowing constellations Hermione had once cast above his bed. He imagined her in the ministry, surrounded by books, fighting words with words. He imagined George upstairs in the flat above the shop, maybe talking to Fred as if Fred could answer. He imagined Harry in his own bed, trying to sleep without nightmares. And Ron thought, with quiet dread, that the war had taught him how to face death. But it hadn't taught him how to face this slow pulling apart, this feeling that peace demanded a different kind of courage, because battle was obvious. But life was subtle, and subtle things could still break you if you weren't paying attention. The rain began as a whisper. It tapped gently against the window panes of Hermione's small ministry office, each droplet a soft, steady rhythm that made the late night feel even quieter. London beyond the glass was blurred by water and darkness, street lamps smeared into pale halos. Inside, Hermione's world was candlelight and parchment. It was Thursday evening, late enough that the corridors outside had emptied hours ago, late enough that even the ministry's usual hum of activity had sunk to a muted throb. Somewhere far away, enchanted maintenance charms moved through halls like invisible caretakers. Somewhere above, the atrium fountain splashed softly in the dark, oblivious to the fact that the building felt haunted at night. Hermione sat hunched over her desk, quill moving with fierce precision. Stacks of books surrounded her like walls, legal texts with cracked spines, old case reports sealed with wax, loose parchment covered in her tight handwriting, arguments scribbled in margins, references cross-linked with obsessive care. She had not meant to stay this late. She always meant that, but then she had found something. The Heritage Verification Statute of 1811 lay open in front of her, its ink formal and cruel. The language was polite, almost gentle, and that was what made it worse. It made discrimination sound like administrative necessity. Muggle-born children shall submit to mandatory heritage testing to verify absence of squib ancestry or fraudulent manifestation. Fraudulent, as if magic could be stolen, as if her existence was suspect by default. Hermione's jaw tightened, and her quill scratched harder as she wrote. 3 days of research had stolen her sleep and eaten her meals. 3 days of digging had scraped at something old inside her, the same exhaustion and fury that had driven her through Hogwarts, through war, through every moment she'd ever been made to feel like she had to prove she belonged. She should have gone home hours ago. She should have stopped. But she couldn't. Not when she could feel the shape of the argument forming, clear and sharp and powerful, like a spell that was finally ready to be cast. She turned another page of an ancient case file and froze. There it was. A precedent. Not obscure, not flimsy. Solid, unmistakable, written in the formal language of the Wisengamot itself. 1823. A case involving the Greengrass family. A pure-blood child had been subjected to heritage testing, under suspicion of squib ancestry. The family had argued that the test violated privacy and magical autonomy. The Wizengamot of that era had ruled in their favor. Testing purebloods was declared an invasion. Hermione's breath caught. If heritage testing violated the autonomy of a pureblood family, then the entire foundation of mandatory testing for Muggle-born children collapsed. The precedent didn't just weaken the statute. It undermined it. Hermione's hands trembled slightly as she flipped back through the file, rereading, confirming, forcing herself to be certain. It was brilliant. It was infuriating. It was perfect. And Ron had no idea, because Ron was somewhere training or patrolling or running between the shop and the Aurora office, and trying to carry too much the way she was. Hermione set down her quill and rubbed her eyes, fingertips pressing hard against the ache behind them. Her shoulders felt stiff, her wrists felt sore. She realized, with a sudden, quiet shock, that she was alone. Not just alone in the office. Alone in a deeper way. When had this become her life? When had she traded the warmth of Ron's presence for the cold satisfaction of legal victories? When had they last had a conversation longer than 10 minutes that wasn't about schedules, apologies, and promises to do better? Sunday, she thought automatically. Sunday was their anchor now, their promise. The day they kept for each other like a protected spell. Except Sunday had become fragile too. She had promised him last week, one whole day together at the Burrow. No work, no training, just them. And then Ron had sent an owl this morning, tired and apologetic, explaining that a raid had been moved. Saturday night now. High urgency. Could they postpone to next Sunday? Hermione had stared at the letter with exhaustion pooling in her chest and sent back a single word. Fine. Fine, as if she didn't care. Fine, as if she wasn't terrified that next Sunday might become the way people drifted apart without ever meaning to. Now, alone in the late-night ministry, she felt the truth settle like weight in her bones. Nothing was fine, not really. A soft knock came at her door. Hermione looked up sharply, startled by how quickly her nerves jumped these days. Then she saw Marcus Whitby leaning in the doorway, coat damp from the rain, expression tired and concerned. "Still here," he said, voice gentle. Hermione tried to smile. It came out thin. "I found something," she said, unable to keep the thrill out of her tone even through exhaustion. "Marcus, I found a precedent that could overturn the heritage verification statute entirely." Marcus stepped into the office and looked around at the stacks of books, the scattered notes, the candle stubs burned nearly to wax puddles. "Hermione," he said quietly, "it's after 10. So," she replied too quickly, then forced herself to soften. "The hearing is Monday. I need to be ready." "The precedent will still exist tomorrow," Marcus said. Hermione opened her mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. She was too tired to summon her usual indignation, too tired to pretend she wasn't hanging on by a thread. Marcus's gaze flicked over her face. "When did you last sleep properly?" he asked. Hermione hesitated, then said honestly, "I don't remember." Marcus exhaled slowly and pulled the chair opposite her desk closer, sitting down with the calm patience of someone who had watched too many bright young people burn themselves out. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I'm not telling you as your superior. I'm telling you as someone who cares whether you survive this work in one piece." Hermione's throat tightened again, but she nodded. "I used to be like you," Marcus continued. 20 years ago, I was fresh out of Hogwarts, full of righteous fury. I worked every hour, fought every battle, said yes to every case, convinced myself that if I slowed down for even a moment, the world would remain unjust because of my weakness. He paused, letting the rain fill the silence. And do you know what happened? Hermione swallowed. You won, she guessed bitterly. Marcus's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. No, he said. I broke. Hermione blinked. I burned out so completely that I couldn't open a law book without feeling sick, Marcus said quietly. 6 months. I couldn't work. I couldn't fight. I couldn't do anything except stare at walls and feel like my body had turned against me. Hermione's chest tightened with something like fear. In those 6 months, Marcus went on, every case I'd been carrying stalled. Every reform I tried to push forward slowed, because I had built everything on my own exhaustion. I had made myself essential to progress, and when I collapsed, progress collapsed too. Hermione's fingers curled around the edge of her desk. What did you do? She asked. Marcus leaned forward. I learned to pace, he said. I learned that systemic change is a marathon, not a sprint. I learned that building a team is not failure. Delegating is not weakness. Taking care of yourself is not selfish. Hermione stared at him, as if the idea was both simple and impossible. And I learned, Marcus added gently, that your relationships are part of your foundation. If you neglect them, you don't become a stronger advocate. You become a lonely one. Hermione's eyes burned. She looked down at the green grass precedent, the neat lines of ink that could change everything. Then she thought of Ron. Ron, who had been waiting at the Burrow kitchen table with his tea cooling, alone again. Ron, who was risking his life in alleys and raids and training rooms. Ron, who had promised they would make it work, even as the time between them stretched thinner. I don't know how to stop, Hermione whispered. Marcus's voice softened. Practice, he said. Start small. Go home tonight. Sleep. Let your mind rest. The work will still be there Monday, and you'll fight better with a clear head. If you don't rest now, you will make mistakes later. Hermione wanted to argue. She wanted to insist she couldn't. But she also knew, deep down, under pride and fear, that she was already making mistakes. Not in her research, in her life. When Marcus left, Hermione sat alone for a long moment, listening to the rain. Then she began to put her papers in order, carefully filing the green grass precedent. She stacked her notes neatly, extinguished the candles, and pulled her coat on. It felt strange, leaving before she had finished everything. It felt wrong. It also felt like breathing after holding her breath too long. Outside, the rain was cold against her face. It soaked her hair. It made the streets shine. It made the world smell clean and damp and real. Hermione apparated to Camden, to the tiny flat she'd rented above a Muggle bookshop. The space was small, but it was hers. One room, a narrow kitchen corner, a bed that felt too empty lately. The enchanted wireless played softly, because Hermione couldn't bear silence when she came home alone. Crookshanks twined around her ankles, purring with pointed insistence. I know, Hermione murmured, crouching to scratch behind his ears. I'm late. I'm always late. Crookshanks only stared at her and then walked towards his food bowl, as if reminding her that someone needed something simple from her. Food, care, presence. Hermione fed him, then stood in her small kitchen, staring at the cold leftovers in her icebox. She didn't want them. She didn't want anything except Ron. Not the idea of Ron. Not the distant comfort of knowing he existed somewhere, Ron in the kitchen with her. Ron's laugh, Ron's hand warm over hers, Ron's voice saying something ridiculous, just to make her smile. Hermione's throat tightened. She took parchment from the drawer, dipped her quill, and began to write. Ron, I know you're on a mission. I know Sunday is complicated now, but when you get back, whenever you get back, I need to see you. Really see you. Not just pass each other like ghosts in the burrow. I miss you. I miss us. I miss knowing what you're thinking, what makes you laugh, what keeps you awake at night. I miss being part of your life instead of just a name in your schedule. Please, when this is done, can we find time, real time? I love you. I'm sorry I've been so absent. I'm trying to do better. Always yours, Hermione. She stared at the words for a long moment after she finished, heart aching. Then she sealed the letter and sent it with her ministry owl, watching the bird vanish into rain-dark night, carrying her honesty across the city. And far from Camden, far from the warm light of bookshops and quiet flats, Ron Weasley crouched behind an ancient oak in a forest in Wales. Night pressed in thick and damp, leaves dripping with rain, the air sharp with the smell of earth and moss. Ahead of him, a cottage sat in a clearing. It looked harmless at first glance, small, weathered. The sort of place a lonely old wizard might live. But the wards around it made Ron's skin prickle. Dark magic coiled there like thorns, sharp and ready. Beside him, Harry checked his sneakoscope for the third time, jaw tight. Behind them, 6 Aurors waited in silence. Williamson's shape was barely visible, but his presence felt solid. The raid had been planned for days. Intelligence suggested a remnant cell, 3, maybe 4 Death Eaters, using the cottage as a base. Coordinating, planning, not just hiding. Williamson's voice was a low murmur. Remember, we want them alive, if possible. Dead men don't talk. But if it comes down to them or you, choose you. Ron's heart beat slow and heavy. This fear felt different from war fear. War fear had been everywhere, all the time, until it became normal. This fear was sharper, because now Ron had a future to lose. He had plans. He had Hermione. He thought of her letter. He'd received it earlier that day, a quick owl delivery he'd stuffed into his pocket and promised himself he'd read properly later. He'd only skimmed enough to see her handwriting. The words, I miss you, and something in him had tightened. Later, he'd thought. After the raid, after this, he shifted his grip on his wand. We'll talk after, he promised himself. We'll fix it. We'll make time. I'll show up better. Ow! Weasley, Williamson hissed softly, not unkind. You with us? Ron blinked hard, forcing his mind back into the forest, back into the present. Yeah, he whispered. Ready. Good, Williamson said. Because we're going in. He counted them down with 2 fingers. 3, 2, 1. Now, they moved as one unit. Wands raised, steps silent on wet ground. As they crossed the clearing, Ron felt the wards resist them. Dark magic pressing back against their presence like an invisible wall. Williamson dispelled them with a complex counter-curse that made the air shimmer and crack. Then they were through. The front door burst inward. The inside of the cottage was larger than it should have been, expanded by magic. Dark artifacts pulsed on shelves. Cursed objects hummed softly like sleeping insects. A table in the center held maps and parchments, and something that looked like a list of names. 4 robed figures spun toward them. Wands flashed. Chaos erupted. Curses filled the air like knives. Cruciatus. Killing curses. Slicing spells. No hesitation. No mercy. These weren't frightened stragglers. These were people who had chosen darkness and kept choosing it. Ron dove behind an overturned table, shouting, "Stunning spells over the top." Harry was dueling two at once, movements fluid and deadly efficient. The war had turned him into something terrifyingly competent. An Auror went down with a scream, hit by a curse Ron didn't recognize. Incendio, one of the Death Eaters roared. Fire exploded up the walls. Not normal fire, but magical flame that moved too fast and burned too hungry. It climbed like it was alive. "Fall back," Williamson shouted. "Out. Regroup outside." Ron scrambled backward, covering the retreat. He saw Harry ahead of him, focused on the Death Eater in front, wand locked in rapid exchange. Then Ron saw what Harry didn't, a Death Eater behind Harry, wand raised, aiming at Harry's back. A killing curse forming in their throat. Time slowed. Ron didn't think. He moved. He threw himself between Harry and the Death Eater, shield charm snapping into place on instinct. Protego, the curse hit the shield with the force of a physical blow. Ron felt his magical core strain, felt the protection bend under pressure. It held, barely deflecting the green light upward into the burning ceiling, but the effort left Ron exposed. And another Death Eater saw the opening. "Defindo," they shrieked. The slicing curse caught Ron in the left side, cutting through robe and flesh with white-hot agony. The world tilted. Ron hit the floor hard. His wand skittered away from fingers that suddenly didn't want to work. Blood spread quickly, warm and shocking. The pain was extraordinary, stealing his breath, turning his vision bright at the edges. He heard shouting, Harry's voice, Williamson's orders, auras moving. But it sounded far away now, muffled, like he was underwater. Strong hands grabbed him, Harry's hands, dragging him toward the door. Ron tried to help, tried to push up, but his body refused. Outside, cold air hit his face. Someone pressed a wand to his wound, muttering healing charms. But the blood kept coming. "Stay with me," Harry's voice said, tight with fear. "Ron, stay with me." Ron tried to smile. "I'm fine," he managed, absurdly. He wasn't. The forest above him blurred. The stars were hidden by cloud and rain. And in that drifting moment, as his consciousness began to slip, Ron thought of Hermione's letter still unread in his pocket. "I miss you. I need to see you." The words swam through his mind like a spell he had failed to cast in time. "I should have made time," he thought with sudden crystal clarity. "I should have always made time." Then darkness rolled in, gentle and absolute, and Ron Weasley knew nothing more. The Burrow's kitchen was quiet in the way it only ever became quiet now. Never peaceful, never truly calm, but hushed like a room trying not to disturb grief that slept lightly. The clock on the wall ticked with a steady, stubborn rhythm. Its hands no longer swung wildly toward mortal peril the way they had during the war, but Molly Weasley still watched it the way people watch a horizon after a storm, half expecting another wave to rise without warning. She had dozed in a chair by the fire, shawl pulled around her shoulders, a book open and unread on her lap. She told herself she was resting. In truth, she was waiting. Mothers learn to wait the way soldiers learn to stand guard, quietly, relentlessly, without ever admitting they were afraid. The first warning came from the flames, not the gentle flicker of the hearth, but the sudden roar of emerald green in the kitchen fireplace, the flue igniting with urgency, sparks flying out over the stone. Molly bolted upright, heart snapping awake before her mind had time to catch up. Arthur's chair scraped in the next room. Footsteps thudded on the stairs. But Molly was already moving, already standing, already bracing herself for whatever the flames were about to bring. Harry Potter stumbled through first. His robes were torn. His face was grey with soot and rain. There was blood on his sleeve. Too much blood. And for a split second, Molly couldn't make sense of the image because her mind refused to accept that the war's horror had followed them into peace. "Mrs. Weasley," Harry said, and his voice was not the voice of a boy at all. It was the voice of someone carrying unbearable news and trying not to collapse under it. It's Ron." Molly felt her stomach drop so hard it was like falling. "No," she whispered. Not as a word, but as a plea. Harry swallowed. His eyes were red-rimmed, wide with fear. "There was a raid," he said. "Wales. He was hit. He's at St. Mungo's." For a heartbeat, Molly couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind flashed through images too quickly. Ron as a toddler with mud on his hands. Ron at 11 with a too big wand. Ron at 17 leaving for a war he didn't deserve. Ron laughing in the kitchen 2 mornings ago. Then her body remembered what her mind couldn't afford. Move. Do something. She grabbed her emergency bag from the shelf, where it had lived since the first time they'd lost someone. She didn't remember packing it. She only knew it was always ready. Arthur appeared in the doorway, hair rumpled, face already pale. "What's happened?" he demanded. But his voice shook, and Molly knew he already understood. Harry turned to him. "It's Ron," Harry repeated, and something cracked in Arthur's face. Molly didn't let herself think. Thinking was a luxury. Panic would eat her alive if she gave it space. She threw flue powder into the flames with a hand that trembled only slightly. "St. Mungo's," she cried, and stepped in. The world spun green and hot and disorienting. When she landed, it wasn't into calm. It was into controlled chaos. The emergency receiving ward at St. Mungo's was a blur of lime green robes and urgent footsteps. Healers moved between beds with focused speed, wands darting, voices quick and sharp. The air was thick with the smell of blood and antiseptic potions. Somewhere nearby, someone moaned in pain. Somewhere else, someone cried quietly into their hands. Molly pushed forward like a force of nature. Her eyes scanned the room with desperate precision until she saw him. Ron. He lay on a bed near the far wall, surrounded by 3 healers working over him with grim concentration. His robes had been cut away. A long, vicious gash ran along his left side, too deep, too wide. Flesh laid open in a way that made Molly's knees threaten to buckle. Blood soaked the sheets beneath him despite the healer's charms. His face, her son's face, was pale as parchment. The freckles across his nose stood out like ink stains. His mouth was slightly open, as if he'd been trying to breathe through pain even in unconsciousness. Molly's heart screamed. She forced her voice to stay sharp, because sharp meant functional. "How bad?" she demanded. One healer, a witch with a tight bun and sweat on her brow, glanced up briefly. "Modified Diffindo," she said, "deeper than standard cutting curses. It's resisting healing. There's curse residue in the tissue. We're knitting it layer by layer." Molly's throat tightened. "He's lost a lot of blood," the healer added, and the words struck like a blow. Arthur stumbled into the ward moments later, breathless from the flu, and Molly felt his hand find hers, grip hard as if holding on to her was the only thing keeping him upright. They stood together, helpless, watching their child fight for his life. There were few things worse than battle, but watching someone you love bleed, while you can do nothing, was one of them. A voice spoke behind them. He saved Harry's life. Molly turned to see Williamson, the senior Auror, standing with rain still clinging to his coat. face drawn with exhaustion. He looked like a man who had carried too many bodies in his career and had never grown used to it. A Death Eater had Harry's back, Williamson said quietly. Killing curse. Ron threw himself in front, shielded him, took the slicing curse instead. Arthur closed his eyes, his grip tightening until Molly's fingers ached. Of course he did, Molly thought with a fierce, broken mixture of pride and despair. Of course, Ron had done it. He had always been like that, loyal to the point of recklessness, brave without ever wanting to call himself brave. He would throw himself into fire for the people he loved, and only realize afterward that he'd been burning. The thought made cold fear crawl through Molly's veins. Not again. Not another son. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Where's Hermione? Arthur asked suddenly, voice hoarse. Has anyone told Hermione? Harry's face tightened, guilt flickering. I sent an owl, he said, to her flat. But she works late. I don't know if she's there. Molly's decision was instant. I'll go, she said. Arthur looked at her, startled. Molly, she needs to know. Molly cut in, voice trembling now despite her effort. And Ron will want her here. You stay. You stay with him. Arthur nodded, swallowing hard. Be quick. Molly turned and strode back toward the flue, heart pounding. The ministry was the last place she wanted to go in the middle of the night, but there was no choice. Hermione had become family, had been family for years now, even before anyone said it out loud. And family showed up. The Ministry of Magic at 3 in the morning was a different world. The atrium was vast and echoing, the fountain silent, the enchanted ceiling dim. The usual bustle was gone. Only the soft footsteps of night security guards and the faint hum of maintenance magic moved through the space. Molly hurried past the empty visitor desk and down the corridors she remembered from the few times she'd brought Hermione food or tried to convince her, gently, helplessly, to rest. The Department of Magical Law was lit. One single lamp burned against the darkness. Molly's heart sank as she approached, because she already knew what she would find. Hermione was at her desk. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, curls escaping in every direction. Her robes were rumpled, sleeves pushed up. Her quill moved across parchment with mechanical precision, as if she were trying to outrun exhaustion by refusing to acknowledge it. She didn't look up when Molly entered. She didn't hear the footsteps. Hermione had learned to tune the world out when she worked, the way a person learned to ignore pain until it became dangerous. Hermione, Molly said gently. Hermione's head snapped up. Confusion crossed her face first, then surprise. Mrs. Weasley? She said, blinking. What are you doing here? Is everything? The tear tracks, the trembling mouth Molly couldn't quite control anymore. The fear in her eyes. Hermione's face drained of color. No, she whispered. No, please. Molly crossed the room quickly and took Hermione's hands. Listen to me, Molly said, forcing calm into her voice, because Hermione was already starting to shake. Ron is alive. He's alive, but he's hurt. He's at St. Mungo's. You need to come now. Hermione made a sound that wasn't a word, something raw and broken, like her breath had been punched out of her. She was already moving, already snatching up her coat with hands that couldn't quite coordinate. How bad? She demanded, voice shaking. What happened? Cutting curse, Molly said, keeping her grip steady on Hermione's arm. Deep. They're healing him now. He saved Harry's life. Hermione's eyes filled instantly. Of course he did, she whispered, tears spilling before she could stop them. Of course he did. Her voice broke on the next breath. The brave, stupid, wonderful. She couldn't finish. She couldn't. Molly pulled her forward toward the flue. Come on, she murmured. Come on, love. They arrived at St. Mungo's together, stumbling out of green flames into the bright, harsh light of the emergency ward. Hermione's eyes searched wildly until she saw Ron's bed. He was still surrounded by healers, but something had shifted in the air. The frantic edge had softened. The lead healer stepped back, wiping sweat from her brow, expression cautious but relieved. We've stabilized him, she announced. Molly's knees nearly gave. Arthur caught her, holding her upright, and she realized she'd been running on pure terror and stubbornness, and now relief was trying to knock her down. The bleeding is under control, the healer continued. We've repaired most of the deep tissue damage. He'll need observation. There will likely be scarring, but barring complications, he should make a full recovery. Molly let out a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh, or both. Arthur's arms tightened around her, but Hermione didn't move. She stood frozen, staring at Ron's face, as if she needed to convince herself it was real, that he was still here, that she hadn't lost him while she sat under a lamp at the ministry writing laws. Can I? Hermione's voice came out as a whisper. Can I sit with him? The healer's expression softened. Of course, she said. We're moving him to a private room upstairs. You can stay as long as you like. They moved Ron to the 4th floor, to a quieter ward reserved for oral injuries. The room was small, clean, and bright with pale morning light creeping in. Hermione pulled a chair to his bedside as soon as they were alone enough. She took Ron's hand, the one not wrapped in bandages, and held it like she was afraid the world might try to steal him again if she loosened her grip. Tears fell silently onto their joined fingers. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't speak. She simply stayed. The Weasley family arrived in waves as dawn approached. George came first, hair wild, still in pajamas, face stricken. Bill and Fleur arrived from Shell Cottage with salt air still clinging to them. Charlie apparated in from Romania, looking shaken and furious. Percy arrived with his collar half-fastened and his eyes red, propriety forgotten. Ginny came with Harry, who looked like he'd aged 5 years in one night. They filled the room with Weasley presence. Too much love for too small a space. A chaotic protective force that pressed close around Ron's bed. But Hermione didn't move from her chair. She didn't let go of his hand. Molly watched her with a deep, aching sympathy. She recognized that look. She had worn it herself too many times. The look of someone realizing how fragile everything was. How quickly the world could take. How is he? George asked, voice rough as if it hurt to speak. He'll recover, Molly said, and the words tasted like prayer. He's stable. He's healing. George nodded, swallowing hard, and sat on the other side of Ron's bed, staring at his brother's face as if memorizing it. He's too stubborn to die, George said fiercely, forcing humor into the room like a charm. Survived a war. Survived Voldemort. Survived being my guinea pig for product testing. A cutting curse isn't going to take him out. Someone let out a shaky laugh. Hermione's grip tightened. She still didn't speak. Molly leaned down and touched Hermione's shoulder gently. You should rest, dear, she murmured. There's a cot in the corner. Hermione shook her head without looking away from Ron. I'm not leaving him, she whispered. I can't. Then at least eat something, Molly insisted softly. You'll be no good to him if you collapse. Hermione's voice cracked. I don't deserve to eat. The room went very still. Molly's heart clenched. Hermione's eyes stayed fixed on Ron, but the words poured out now, unstoppable, like a dam breaking. "Do you know when I last really talked to him?" Hermione whispered. "Really talked? 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. We had breakfast for 30 minutes, and I spent 20 of them reading case files." Ginny moved closer, face pale with sympathy. Hermione? Hermione shook her head violently, tears streaming. "He asked me to postpone Sunday," Hermione said, voice shaking. "And I said fine. Fine, like it didn't matter. Like seeing him wasn't the most important thing in my life." Her breath hitched. "And then your mother had to come find me at the ministry at 3 in the morning because I was still working, because I couldn't stop, because I didn't think. I didn't think." Her voice broke into a sob. "What if he died?" she whispered. "What if the last meaningful thing I said to him was fine?" She wrapped her arms around Hermione and pulled her into a fierce, protective hug, holding her the way she held her children when the world hurt them. "Oh, my dear girl," Molly murmured. "No, no, don't do that to yourself." Hermione clung to her, shoulders shaking. "I don't know how to do this," Hermione choked out. "I don't know how to be the person who changes the world and the person who's there for him. There aren't enough hours. There isn't enough of me." George spoke quietly from Ron's bedside, voice softer than anyone expected. "You're not the only one," he said. "Ron's been doing the same thing, running between the shop and the auras like he can split himself in half and survive it." Hermione let out a wet laugh that sounded like pain. "We're both idiots," she whispered. "Yeah," George agreed gently. "You are. But you're our idiots." For a moment the room held that softness, grief and love tangled together, imperfect and human. Then Ron stirred, just slightly. A faint groan escaped him. Everyone went silent instantly. Leaning forward, Hermione snapped upright, both hands clasping his. "Ron," she whispered. "Ron, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, his eyes opened a fraction, unfocused at first, then slowly finding her face. For a moment, he looked confused. Then recognition warmed his features. And Ron smiled. Small, soft, that slightly dopey smile that made Hermione's heart ache because it was so purely him. "Hermione," he rasped, voice rough. "You're here." "Of course I'm here," she whispered, tears spilling again. "Where else would I be?" Ron's brows pulled together faintly, as if the fog of potion and pain couldn't quite make sense of everything. "Thought you'd be," he mumbled. "Ministry. Changing the world. Being brilliant." Hermione let out a shaky laugh that cracked into a sob. "The world can wait," she said firmly, leaning closer as if saying it could anchor it into reality. "You can't." Ron's smile deepened a fraction. "Missed you," he murmured, voice fading as sleep pulled him back under. "Missed you so much." "I missed you too," Hermione whispered fiercely. "I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry I haven't been here." Ron's eyes drifted closed again, his breathing settling into the slow rhythm of healing rest. Hermione pressed her forehead gently to his hand. And in that quiet room filled with family and morning light, she made a promise she didn't speak out loud. Things were going to change. Not next week, not after the next hearing, not when the ministry was less busy. Now. Because she had just been reminded, cruelly, clearly, that later was not guaranteed. Ron woke properly 2 days later. Not the half-drifting, potion-fobbed version of waking, where the world came in fragments and voices sounded like they were underwater. This time, his eyes opened, and stayed open. This time, he could focus long enough to recognize the room, the pale curtains, the small vase of flowers his mother had definitely conjured into existence the moment a healer said the word stable. Sunlight poured through the window in a slow, gentle sheet, turning the white walls warm. For a moment, Ron lay still and listened. He could hear soft footsteps in the corridor, a distant clink of glass, the faint murmur of voices, hospital sounds, life continuing. Then he felt it. A hand, warm and familiar, wrapped around his. He turned his head slightly and saw Hermione curled in the chair beside his bed, asleep in a position that looked both uncomfortable and stubbornly determined. Her hair had escaped any attempt at order. Her robes were wrinkled, as if she'd been wearing them for days. There were dark circles under her eyes that made Ron's chest tighten with affection and something like guilt. She looked terrible. She looked like she'd been holding herself upright with sheer will. She also looked like the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Ron shifted carefully. His side protested with a dull pull that reminded him exactly where he was and why. He hissed softly through his teeth. Hermione's eyes snapped open instantly. Not slowly, not sleepily, instantly, like someone who hadn't truly been resting at all. Her gaze locked onto his face, and relief hit her so visibly that Ron almost felt it in his own body. "Ron," she breathed. Her voice was rough, as if she'd been prying and not drinking enough water. "You're awake, properly awake." Ron managed a faint grin. "Suppose so," he rasped. "Unless this is another dream, and I'm about to wake up and find I'm actually at the burrow, and Mum's yelling at me for tracking mud in." Hermione made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't broken halfway into a sob. She leaned forward fast, gripping his hand tighter, as if touching him was the only proof he existed. "How do you feel?" she demanded. "Like I got hit by a cutting curse," Ron said honestly. "But alive, which is an improvement." Hermione's face crumpled. "Don't," she said, fierce. "Don't joke. Ron, you nearly died." She couldn't finish the sentence. Her voice cracked, and tears spilled down her cheeks with a suddenness that made Ron's throat tighten. He squeezed her hand as gently as he could. "But I didn't," he murmured. "I'm here." Hermione shook her head. Anger and fear tangled together like ivy. "You threw yourself in front of a curse," she said, voice shaking. "Again. Just like the war. Just like always. You act like your life matters less than everyone else's. Harry's my best mate." Ron wanted to snap back, but he stopped himself. He heard the tremor in her voice. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes. He understood, with a sudden clarity, that she wasn't scolding him because she was angry. She was scolding him because she was terrified. Harry was about to die. Ron said quietly, "What was I supposed to do?" Hermione's mouth trembled. "Survive," she whispered. "You're supposed to survive. You're supposed to come home." Her voice rose on the next breath, not loud, but raw. "You're supposed to be here for our future, for our life, for all the things we keep putting off because we're too busy trying to save everyone else." Ron's chest tightened. He stared at her, and for the first time since waking fully, he felt a fear that had nothing to do with curses. He had scared her in a way he didn't know how to fix with a joke or a promise. Hermione wiped her tears with the back of her hand, irritated with herself, then stood abruptly and paced to the window as if she needed distance to keep from collapsing. "I went to the hearing yesterday," she said, voice thin. "The one about the heritage verification statute." Ron blinked, trying to sit up slightly, then stopped when his side pulled hard. "You went?" he said. "Hermione," Marcus presented it. Hermione cut in. "I gave him my research. I gave him everything, and we won." Ron felt a surge of pride despite the pain. "That's brilliant," he said softly. "That's Hermione, that's huge." Hermione didn't sound triumphant. "The statute was overturned," she said, and her voice held something like emptiness. A landmark victory. She turned back to face him, eyes bright with unshed tears. And all I could think was, "I don't care." Ron stared. "I didn't care," Hermione repeated, as if saying it twice might make it easier to accept. "Not in that moment. Not when I was sitting in that cold chamber, and people were congratulating me, and the law was changing, and the world was shifting." Her voice broke. "Because you were lying here, and I wasn't here when you woke up the first time. Your mother had to come find me at 3 in the morning because I was still working." Hermione crossed the room and knelt beside his bed, so they were eye level. She looked smaller like that, despite her strength. More human. "I've spent my whole life fighting to prove I belong," she whispered. "To prove I'm worthy. And somewhere along the way, I started believing my worth was measured in how much I could accomplish, how many wrongs I could correct, how hard I could work." Her breath hitched. "I forgot that I already belong, that I'm already enough." Ron felt his eyes burn, not because he hadn't known she carried that, but because he hated that she still did. Hermione reached up, touching his wrist as if checking he was real. "You never asked me to prove anything," she said. "You've loved me exactly as I am, bossy and difficult and relentless, and I've been so busy saving the world that I stopped showing up for the person who matters most." Ron swallowed hard. He wanted to tell her it wasn't true, but he also knew it was. He had felt the drift too, the silence growing, the notes on the table replacing actual evenings together. And he had done the same thing in his own way. "I haven't been present either," Ron admitted quietly. Hermione blinked. Ron looked up at the ceiling for a moment, gathering his words like someone gathering courage before stepping into a fight. "Between helping George and training and patrols," he said, "I kept thinking I had to do it all, had to prove I deserved the Aurora job, had to fix the shop for George, had to be strong enough for everyone." He let out a shaky breath, and I was so exhausted trying to juggle everything that the most important thing, us, started slipping. Hermione's eyes shimmered. "So what do we do?" she whispered. Ron's mind, trained now to think in tactics and choices, clicked into that careful clarity. "We choose," he said slowly. Hermione's brows knit. "We choose what we're willing to keep doing," Ron continued, voice steadying. "We choose what we're willing to stop doing. We choose each other first, and we build everything else around that, instead of trying to squeeze us into the leftover spaces." Hermione stared at him, and Ron could practically see her mind racing through possibilities and objections and logistics. "But the work matters," she said immediately, voice urgent. "It matters, Ron. Reforming the ministry matters. Hunting Death Eaters matters. George matters." "It does," Ron agreed, "but it doesn't matter more than us. If we destroy ourselves, we won't be able to do any of it anyway." Hermione's shoulders rose with a deep inhale, then fell. She stood and began pacing again, but this time her pacing wasn't frantic. It was purposeful. "I need to delegate," she said, almost to herself. Marcus has been telling me that for weeks. I don't have to personally fight every battle. I can train others, build a team, make it sustainable, instead of running myself into the ground. Ron nodded. That sounds like Hermione Granger, he said softly. Fixing the system and teaching others how to fix it too. Hermione shot him a look that was half affectionate, half grim. And you, she said. You can't keep splitting yourself between the shop and Auror training and missions. You can't be two people. It's not fair to George. It's not fair to the Auror office. And it's not fair to you. Ron's chest tightened again, because this was the part he didn't want to face. George needs me, Ron said quietly. Hermione's expression softened. Ron, she said gently, I visited the shop 3 days ago. Before all this happened. You did? Hermione nodded. I wanted to see George, she admitted, voice quieter. I wanted to apologize for being so absent. And do you know what I saw? Ron waited, heart hammering. The shop was busy, Hermione said. Really busy. George was handling it. He was demonstrating products. He was laughing with customers. He looked, not fine, not completely, but he looked alive. Ron's throat tightened. He's healing, Hermione continued. He's finding his way forward, and he doesn't need you to be Fred. He needs you to be his brother. Those aren't the same thing. Ron stared down at his hands. He had wanted to fix it for George the way he'd wanted to fix everything, by throwing himself into it until it stopped hurting. Hermione crouched again beside him. You helped him, she said softly. You got him through the first unbearable part. You helped him breathe again. But you cannot be the foundation of his entire life. That's too much for you. And it will trap him too. Ron swallowed hard. He began, voice rough. I wanted to carry it with him. I know, Hermione whispered, just like I wanted to carry every injustice alone. They held each other's gaze in that quiet room. And for a moment, it felt like the world outside the window didn't exist. Then the door opened, and a healer stepped in. Cordelia, cheerful and brisk, carrying Ron's chart. Well, she said brightly, look at you, awake and coherent. That's what we like to see. Hermione stood quickly, wiping her face. Cordelia cast a quick diagnostic spell, wand flicking over Ron's wound. Healing nicely, she announced. No infection, no lingering curse residue. You've got a strong constitution, Mr. Weasley. Ron tried to grin. Told you I'm stubborn. Cordelia's eyes twinkled. Stubborn is useful so long as it's paired with common sense. Another 3 days here, then you can go home for bed rest. 2 weeks minimum before any strenuous activity. Ron's eyes widened. 2 weeks? Be grateful it isn't longer, Cordelia said firmly. That was a nasty curse, and no returning to active duty for at least a month. A month. The word hung heavy. It was frightening in a different way than war, because it meant stopping, resting, letting someone else handle things, letting the world continue without him. When Cordelia left, Hermione sat back down, quieter now. Ron stared at the ceiling for a long moment, then spoke. I think I want to stay with the Auras, he said slowly. But not like this. Not field work right away. Maybe not constant raids. Hermione's eyes sharpened. What are you thinking? Ron breathed out. Kingsley mentioned they need instructors, he said. People who can train recruits properly. Teach them what war really looks like. Teach them to survive. I could do that. It's still important, still protective, but it's safer. Regular hours, Hermione's face brightened with relief and pride so intense it almost made her laugh. "That sounds perfect," she whispered. "Ron, you'd be brilliant at that." "And you?" Ron asked gently. "What are you choosing?" Hermione's fingers tightened around his. "I'm staying with the legal reform work," she said. "But I'm building a team. I'm delegating the research and the endless late-night drafting. I'm focusing on the big cases, the strategy, the structure, and I'm leaving the office at a human hour." Ron's mouth quirked. "You mean you'll stop trying to personally fight the entire ministry?" Hermione gave him a look. "I said I'm trying," she corrected. "I didn't say I've become magically easygoing overnight." Ron smiled, and the smile felt like a small return to themselves. "And us," Ron said quietly. "What are we choosing for us?" Hermione answered immediately, as if the words had been waiting behind her teeth. "Sunday dinners at the Burrow," she said. "Non-negotiable, every week, even if the world is loud." Ron nodded. "Wednesday lunches," he added, "in Diagon Alley. You can come by the shop. We can eat somewhere warm. Talk like we're actual people." Hermione's eyes softened. "Evenings at home," she said. "At least 3 nights a week. No work, no emergencies, unless someone is literally bleeding." Ron's gaze held hers. "A real home," he said. "Not your tiny flat. Not my room at the Burrow. A place that's ours." Hermione's lips parted, and for a moment she looked like she might cry again. "A place that's ours," she whispered, voice full of wonder. "Yes." The door burst open then, and George strode in like a storm, hair wild, face pale from lack of sleep, but eyes fierce. "Finally," George declared, voice too loud for a hospital ward. "The healer said you were actually awake. Took you long enough, little brother." Ron grinned, despite the tug in his side. "Nice to see you too," he rasped. George crossed to the bed and scanned Ron's face with quick intensity, as if checking each feature for proof Ron was still here. Then George's expression shifted, softened. "Don't you dare do that again," he said quietly. Ron blinked. George's jaw clenched. "Nearly dying," George added, voice rough. "Don't you dare make Mum go through that again. Don't you dare make me go through that again." Ron's throat tightened. He nodded once. "I'll try," he murmured. George snorted. "Try harder." Hermione's hand found Ron's again under the blanket, squeezing. And in that small moment, Ron in a hospital bed, Hermione exhausted beside him, George standing like a guard at the edge of grief, it felt like something shifted. Not the world, not all the problems, but the foundation, like they had finally admitted, out loud, that surviving wasn't the same as living, and that living required choices, hard ones, tender ones, daily ones. The day Ron left St. Mungo's, the sunlight felt too bright, not because it was harsh, but because he wasn't used to standing in the open without bracing for something to strike. Healing did strange things to your sense of time. It slowed everything down. It forced you to notice small details you'd been skimming past for months. The air smelled like rain and early spring leaves. The street outside the hospital was busy with ordinary people doing ordinary things. A witch walked past, laughing with a friend, her shopping bag swinging. A man argued gently with his child about whether they could stop for sweets. Life moved on, stubborn and unromantic and beautiful. Ron stood at the bottom of the hospital steps with his coat pulled tight and his side aching under the weight of his healing scar. Hermione hovered beside him like she'd forgotten how to stand still when she wasn't working. Her eyes kept flicking over him, checking his breathing, checking his posture, checking for signs of pain he wasn't admitting. "You're walking too fast," she said immediately. Ron huffed out a faint laugh. "I'm barely walking at all. You're overcompensating," Hermione insisted. "Slow down." "I'm fine," Ron tried. Hermione's eyes narrowed. "Ron." He surrendered with a sigh. All right, slower." Molly and Arthur stood close, holding themselves together with visible effort. They both looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. The last few days had carved something into them. Another layer of fear. Another reminder that, even after winning a war, you didn't win safety forever. George was there too, hands shoved deep into his pockets, face set in stubborn determination. He'd tried to pretend the hospital hadn't shaken him. He'd failed. "Home," Molly said, voice firm and wobbly at once. "You're coming home, and you're staying put, and you're eating properly." Ron opened his mouth to argue, then saw her face and didn't. "Home," he agreed quietly. Hermione's hand slid into his, fingers threading together with a familiar certainty that felt like returning to solid ground. They apparated as a group, careful and slow, and the world snapped sideways. The burrow's garden greeted them with damp soil and the smell of green things growing. The crooked house looked exactly the same, warm and chaotic, leaning as if it was always mid-laugh. For the first time in weeks, Ron felt himself exhale fully. Inside, Molly fussed immediately. Tea appeared, bread appeared, soup appeared. It was as if food was Molly's way of insisting that life continued, that bodies could be repaired with love and warmth, and enough carbohydrates to drown sorrow. Ron sat at the kitchen table with a blanket around his shoulders, while Hermione stood near the sink, pretending she wasn't watching him every second. He took a spoonful of soup and realized with a strange jolt how hungry he was. Not just physically. Hungry for this. For home. For the sound of his father's quiet humming. For his mother's clattering pots. For Hermione's presence that didn't come in frantic 10-minute windows. After lunch, once Ron had been ordered upstairs for a nap, Hermione followed him. She didn't say she was following. She simply appeared in the doorway of his room as he sat carefully on the edge of his bed. "Are you going to sleep?" she asked. Ron eyed her. "Are you going to let me?" Hermione crossed her arms. "If you don't, I'll hex you." Ron raised a brow, threatening a patient, very ethical. Hermione's mouth twitched, but her eyes stayed serious. "I mean it," she said softly. "You need to heal, properly, not halfway, not good enough, properly." Ron's grin faded. He nodded. "All right," he murmured. "I will." Hermione stood for a moment as if she wanted to leave, then didn't. Instead, she stepped forward and sat on the edge of the bed beside him. There was a silence, not awkward, not empty, full. Hermione's fingers twisted together in her lap. "Can I tell you something without you making a joke about it?" she asked. Ron's throat tightened. "Yeah," he said gently. "Yeah, of course." "I keep thinking about the owl," she whispered. "The one you sent. The one where you asked to postpone Sunday." Ron's stomach dipped. "I'm sorry," he began automatically. Hermione shook her head. "No," she said. "Let me say it properly. I keep thinking about how I replied. Fine. One word. Cold. Like it didn't matter. Like you didn't matter." Her voice cracked slightly. "And then I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't come back. If you died, and the last real thing I sent you was that word. Ron's chest tightened so sharply it almost felt like pain in his scar. Hermione, I know, she said, rushing forward as if stopping would make her crumble. I know you survived. I know you're here. But I didn't know that when your mother walked into my office at 3 in the morning. I didn't know that when I ran through the ministry halls and realized I'd been so unreachable that no one could even find me unless they physically came to drag me out. She swallowed hard. I thought I was being strong, she whispered. I thought I was being responsible. I thought I was doing what the world needed from me. And I was. Some of it. But I was also disappearing. Ron stared at her. He saw the truth in her face, the shame, the exhaustion, the terrifying relief of admitting it. I was disappearing too, Ron said quietly. Hermione looked up. Ron exhaled slowly. I told myself I was doing it for good reasons, he admitted. Helping George, proving myself at training, being useful, being needed. But I was also hiding. Hermione's brows drew together. Hiding from what? Ron hesitated, then forced himself to be honest. From the fact that I didn't know how to be just. Ron, he said. Not the one who fought in a war. Not the one who was brave. Not the one who survived. Just Ron, living a normal day without something terrible waiting around the corner. Hermione's face softened. Ron looked away, embarrassed by how vulnerable it felt. War gives you a purpose, he said quietly. It tells you what to do next. Survive, fight, protect, and then the war ends, and suddenly you're meant to build a life. And it turns out, building is harder than destroying. Hermione's eyes glistened. It is, she whispered. It's terrifying. Ron turned back to her. But I want it, he said. I want the life. I want the home. I want the ordinary days. I want you. And I don't want to lose it because we're too busy being heroic. Hermione's breath shook. She reached for his hand and held it as if grounding herself. We won't, she said, voice fierce and trembling. We won't lose it. Not like that. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped. The room quiet except for the faint clatter of life downstairs. Then Hermione drew a careful breath and said, We should talk to Kingsley. Ron blinked. About what? About your role, Hermione said. About making the instructor position real, official, with proper hours, with proper limits. About protecting you from yourself. Ron let out a soft laugh. You make it sound like I'm a dangerous animal. Hermione's mouth twitched. You are. You're loyal and reckless, and you will throw yourself in front of anything you think might hurt someone you love. Ron opened his mouth, then closed it again because, fair. Hermione continued, voice calmer now. And I should talk to my department head, she added, about my role, about building a team the way Marcus keeps insisting, about not being available at midnight unless the ministry is literally on fire. Ron stared at her. You'd do that? Hermione gave him a look that said she understood exactly how hard it would be. I have to, she said softly, if I want to keep us, if I want to keep me. Ron squeezed her hand. All right, he murmured. We'll do it. It turned out Kingsley didn't need much convincing. Ron and Hermione met him in his office 3 days later. Ron was still pale, still moving carefully, still wearing a healing brace under his shirt. Hermione looked tired, but steadier, like someone who had finally decided to stop sprinting. Kingsley listened without interrupting, leaning back in his chair, hands folded. When Ron finished explaining his idea, staying with the auras, but moving into training and instruction rather than field raids, Kingsley nodded slowly. I've been hoping you'd ask, he admitted. Ron blinked. You have. Kingsley's eyes held quiet understanding. You've got experience no training course can provide, Kingsley said. You know what it's like when things go wrong. You know what panic does to a unit. You know what it costs when someone believes bravery means never stepping back. He paused. And you are exactly the kind of instructor we need. Someone who can teach skill without glamorizing sacrifice. Ron's throat tightened. Kingsley's gaze shifted to Hermione. And you, Kingsley said, voice gentler, are exactly the kind of advocate this ministry needs. But I'd be failing you if I let you destroy yourself trying to rebuild everything alone. Hermione's shoulders rose on a slow inhale. I'm building a team, she said firmly. Delegating, training, creating a structure that outlasts me. Kingsley nodded. Approval, relief. Good, he said. Because if we want a better world, we need people like you, alive, long enough to finish the work. After the meeting, Ron and Hermione walked through the ministry atrium together. It was brighter during the day, less haunting, more ordinary. Hermione watched Ron's face as they moved. How do you feel? She asked. Ron smiled faintly. Like I'm starting over. Hermione's expression softened. That's not a bad thing. No, Ron agreed. It's just strange. But maybe strange is fine. Hermione's fingers slid into his. They apparated from the ministry to Diagon Alley, because life didn't pause just because they'd made decisions. The shop was open. Laughter spilled out the doorway like music. A child darted past, clutching a bag of skiving snack boxes, eyes shining. Inside, George stood behind the counter with sleeves rolled up, looking more alive than he had in months. There were still shadows in his eyes, but the shadows didn't swallow him anymore. They lived beside something else now. Focus, pride, a kind of stubborn hope. When George saw Ron, his expression sharpened. You're out, he said. Not a question. Ron raised both hands in surrender. Technically. George's eyes flicked to Ron's side, then to Hermione, then back. You sit, George ordered. Right now. Ron tried to argue. Hermione stepped behind him and nudged him toward a chair with quiet determination. George leaned over the counter, lowering his voice. So, he said, heard you're going official with the Aurora instructor role. Ron blinked. How'd you hear that? George jerked his chin toward the back of the shop. Lee Jordan. George said, as if that explained everything. Ron laughed weakly. Right. Of course. Good, he said simply. That's good. Ron hesitated, then said, I need to talk to you about the shop. George's mouth twitched. If you say I can still help full-time, I'll hex you myself. Ron blinked. I wasn't going to. George pointed at him. Don't. I was going to say, I can't keep doing what I was doing, but I want to be here. I want to be your brother, not your replacement. George held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, firm. That's what I want too, he said quietly. You already saved me, Ron. You got me through the first part. But I don't need you to carry the shop. I need you to come by sometimes. Laugh at the stupid prototypes. Remind me the world is still ridiculous. Ron's throat tightened. George's voice turned rough. And I need you to live, he added. Because if you can live properly, then maybe I can keep learning how to. Ron nodded, eyes burning. Hermione watched them, her expression full of something tender and fierce. They stayed at the shop for an hour. Ron sat. Hermione drank tea someone conjured. George demonstrated a product that made confetti sneeze out of your nose. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ron laughed without forcing it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was real. And that, somehow, felt like victory. Over the next few weeks, life didn't become perfect, but it became deliberate. Hermione hired 2 junior advocates and began training them the way Marcus had trained her, not just in legal theory, but in stamina, in strategy, in leaving work at a reasonable hour, in building a cause you could survive. Ron took on his first cohort of recruits as an official Auror instructor. He taught them shield charms that could be cast under pressure. He taught them teamwork. He taught them to recognize the moment courage turned into stupidity. And more than anything, he taught them that coming home mattered. At home, real home, a small flat near Diagon Alley they chose together, Hermione and Ron built a rhythm, not grand, not glamorous, but steady. Sunday dinners at the Burrow became sacred. Molly fed them like she was feeding the future itself. Arthur told stories. George dropped in when he felt like it, pretending he hadn't been waiting for that kind of warmth. Wednesday lunches became their quiet anchor. A small table, warm food, Hermione's fingers stained with ink, Ron's hands warm around a mug, both of them talking about the world, and also about nothing at all. 3 evenings a week became theirs. No ministry parchments, no Auror manuals, no emergencies unless someone was bleeding. Sometimes they read side by side. Sometimes Ron talked about his recruits, about the nervous girl who couldn't cast a shield fast enough, about the boy who tried too hard to impress, about the moments that made him remember himself at 17. Sometimes Hermione talked about cases, but she also talked about books she read for pleasure, and Ron pretended to complain while secretly feeling proud every time she chose rest. Sometimes they argued because they were still human, because old habits didn't vanish overnight, because fear made people sharp sometimes, but they learned slowly to come back to each other faster, to apologize sooner, to ask for help instead of collapsing silently. And in the middle of all that, one night, Hermione sat at their small kitchen table while Ron washed dishes and said quietly, "I'm scared I'll slip again." "Me too." Hermione's mouth trembled. "What if we forget?" Ron turned off the tap, dried his hands, and crossed to her. He took her face gently in his hands. "Then we remind each other," he said, "over and over, as many times as it takes." Hermione's eyes filled, but she smiled. "That sounds exhausting," she whispered. Ron's grin was soft. "Yeah," he said, "but it's worth it." And so, dear listener, their greatest victory was not a law overturned or a Death Eater captured, though those mattered. It was this: 2 people who had survived the impossible, learning to build something ordinary without apologizing for wanting it. Learning that peace required courage, too. Learning that showing up again and again was its own kind of magic. And as the seasons turned and London softened into summer, Ron and Hermione became something new. Not just war heroes, not just fighters, but builders, partners. A quiet, steady proof that after darkness you could choose a life that was worth the fight. And that choice, made daily, made deliberately, was the truest magic of all.